ISOCARP, which stands for the International Society of City and Regional Planners. And so you are city and regional planners, and we're presenting to you about how you should be innovating and designing new cities.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's helpful. Thank you.
You're
Okay.
welcome.
So now we're going to start with introducing ourselves on the judging panel.
Do you want to do the rules first?
Sure, I can do that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, welcome to the 25-minute presentation. You will adopt an identity and assign an identity to us as judges. You will begin your presentation to us without, you will begin your presentation and present to us without interruption. After your presentation, we will ask questions within role. So as the ISOCARP. Corp, is that right?
CARP.
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 Okay. ISOCARP. Okay. And then after the Q&A, we will provide feedback on your presentation. This is a blind judging competition. At no time should you reference your university, just your team name, and same for the judges. We will not represent any particular alma mater. Okay.
I'm Chiki Bianco, and I work in television production and compliance for TV networks.
Fantastic.
I'm Jerry Alkind. I used to own a chemical company manufacturing highly toxic chemicals. I transitioned. And now I'm in real estate.
What kind of chemicals?
Cleaning chemicals.
Okay.
And insecticides, not so good.
I used to work in anodizing.
Oh,
so
okay. Oh, that's not
there's some
good,
dangerous
yeah.
chemicals there.
Hi, I'm Melissa Fitzpatrick. I'm an ethics professor.
I am Ernie Roberts. I'm head of sustainability for a global consumer electronics company.
I'm Kendra Jones. I'm Chief Legal and Sustainability Officer for Epson.
Awesome.
Thank you.
The printer company.
The printer company. That's right. That's right. Yeah. No bias.
Kind of looks like it. Just saying.
We knew that.
Would you guys like me to give you a warning on time? Or are you going to keep time yourself, or what can I do?
A warning could be helpful if you
Okay.
could give us, a 3 minute.
I'll do my best.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
No worries.
Okay. Okay. You guys ready? I'll press
Ready?
go.
Yeah.
All right. Let's go.
Thank you for having us, ISOCARP. Deep Roots Consulting is excited to be here today and present Designing Sustainable Cities for a Growing World.
Hello,
I'm Owen Sordillo, and I'm your legal counsel.
I'm Shreya, and I'll be your sustainability expert.
My name is Micah. I'm your ethical advisor.
And I'm Johnny. I'll be your financial specialist.
So as you're aware, ISOCARP's mission is to mobilize professional urban and regional planners to co-implement the visions enshrined in the Sustainable Development Goals set forth by the UN, as well as the new urban agenda. Our presentation today will walk through 3 major issues which can all be benefited by implementing green initiatives and greening strategies throughout cities. Next, Shreya will start by talking about environmental degradation.
Yeah, so I want to start us off by talking a little about how environmental degradation is a major issue within cities. And I'm going to start off by talking about urban heat islands. So as you can see from the statistic here, thousands of deaths have happened in nearly 100 countries from urban heat islands, and this is just within Europe. So urban heat islands refer to how cities tend to be, on average, 1 to 7 degrees hotter than the surrounding areas, and this statistic can go to extremes of nearly 10 degrees in a difference between a city and its surrounding areas in certain situations. And these urban heat islands happen mainly as an effect of carbon emissions and the heat that's absorbed by the urban landscape of cities. Cities tend to have a lot of buildings and pavements in place of what would normally be natural land, and this absorbs a lot of heat, which increases the temperature so much. And next, I'll pass it along to Micah, who will talk about some of the other environmental aspects.
Thank you so much, Shreya. Yeah, so before we want to go into the further issues of environmental degradation, we find it important that we all know what this concept actually means. So when talking about environmental degradation, we're basically referring to the concept of damaging our own environment because we're using up our natural resources. Think about air or water. With this also comes damaging and destroying our natural areas such as oceans or forests, leading us also to a potential extinction risk. So in taking this concept into account, we can see many issues resulting from this. First of all, we can establish a loss of biodiversity. Green spaces are so important for the land of animal and plants. As mentioned, without these green spaces, animals and plants don't have their places to live, not only leaving us with an extinction risk, but also with the loss of a biodiversity. Secondly, we can establish a climate change impact. Green spaces absorb carbon dioxide from the air, cooling down their surroundings. Without these green spaces, many climate-related issues will exist, such as higher levels of air pollution and the mentioned degradation. Now, speaking of pollution and degradation, we can see that it is mainly happening within cities, just like we're talking about today. And an example we want to explain this with is Jakarta in Indonesia. Jakarta is a rapidly growing city, and they're facing many environmental issues, especially related to urbanization and mainly industrialization, leaving them with high levels of traffic congestion and higher levels of air pollution. Now, taking these issues into account, we also want to approach this from an ethical aspect as well. We see that the problem here lies in recognizing our own responsibility to not only take care of ourselves and each other, but also of that surrounding us, that's keeping us alive on the daily, such as the mentioned animals, plants, but also our ecosystems. Now, we want to split this up in two different sides. First of all, we're talking about respect for life. As mentioned, we're responsible for taking care of everything surrounding us and not just ourselves, because that doesn't keep us alive on the daily. Then secondly, we also want to mention justice and equity, which we find very important. We can see that the lack of green spaces can affect many vulnerable communities that are eventually going to have to live with the future consequences. So, taking all these issues into account, we can obviously see we need a solution. We really want to be focusing on green infrastructure here. Green infrastructure basically refers to the process of building with nature. It's not only economical, which we'll talk about more later, but it's mainly very effective, but it also provides more safety and a higher quality of life for our residents. Shreya is now going to talk about these solutions.
Yes, thank you, Micah. So building off of what Micah was saying, there are many simple ways to just incorporate greenery into the pre-existing urban structure. And as you can see in this picture, some of these ways are through green streets, green roofs, like green building facades, or just planting more trees on the streets. And to break down how exactly these will help, essentially the plants help break down the carbon dioxide that's there from the high level of carbon emissions in the cities, and it provides more oxygen while also providing shade, which lowers the temperatures. And on a larger scale, some other action that can be taken is creating parks and fountains. And we really urge you to consider implementing some of these larger scale projects, because it goes along with ISOCARP's own mission statement of mobilizing urban planners to follow and further the sustainable development goals by the UN, and this really pertains to making cities both more safe and sustainable and also lowering climate change. So here are some examples of cities that have in fact implemented some of these larger scale green infrastructure, and although it really helps when a combination of the smaller elements that was shown on the last slide are done in a city, when things like this, big parks are created, this really helps lower temperature and improve air quality on a much larger scale. And so on the right here is Sanktjell Square in Brigervangen, which is in Copenhagen, Denmark. And it's this park built near a very busy intersection. And in addition to this just being a nice park for people to walk through, it also is designed very specifically to reduce surface runoff, and it does this by directing rainwater into the plants and into the sewers so it doesn't go on the streets. And then on the left here is Salesforce Park, which is in San Francisco, California. And this was built in a city where it's already really congested, and it's hard to add a park to the downtown area where so much of the ground area is being taken up. So these city planners built this park to be on top of a building above ground, and you just take an escalator to go up, and then once you go there, there's a lot of green space and there's trees all around. And now here you can see this graphic, and it shows sort of what it would look like if all this green infrastructure is implemented on a larger scale and in a much bigger picture. And now I'll be handing it off to Owen, who will talk about some of the legal implications of green infrastructure.
Thank you, Shreya. So as we're all aware, and it's currently precedent in all 50 states, that heating is provided by landlords to tenants. This is something that is not often challenged, especially in the colder states, as we recognize as people that access to heat, especially in colder states, is a human necessity. Now, every summer, we see record high temperatures recorded in American cities and around the world. Currently there is no access for, there's no federal mandate for landlords to provide tenants with air conditioning. And this disproportionately affects low-income people in low-income housing areas, as they are typically most impacted by the lack of street trees or the lack of parks and the urban heat island effect. To combat this, counties such as Montgomery County in Maryland and Dallas, Texas, have implemented laws that are requiring landlords to provide air conditioning for their tenants. In addition to this, Senator Brown of Ohio has also introduced a bill to the House that would require mitigation strategies in cities to mitigate the urban heat island effect. Johnny?
Ultimately, not only have we seen a couple of air conditioning initiatives pop up in a few counties, we've also seen a global demand worldwide for air conditioning grow. A 2-degree changing temperature can cause anywhere from a 1 to 9% change in demand for air conditioning. It also puts a financial stipulation on the residents of these buildings as well, as now 87% of households in the U.S. have air conditioning, and it can account on average for up to 12% of a house's electricity bill. And this is ultimately where the green spaces come in, as they have this nice cooling effect on the city. Green roofs in also particular can make the roof 30 to 40 degrees cooler than an average roof, and ultimately cool citywide temperatures by up to 5 degrees. This ultimately leads us into our next issue. Not only are we seeing a loss of biodiversity and this environmental degradation, we're also seeing a decline in mental and physical health in these cities as well. As you can see, there's been an incline in obesity as well as a lack of physical activity in these urban environments. I'm going to hand it off to Micah to talk a little bit more about this.
Thank you so much, Johnny. So before we go further into the issues surrounding the urban health crisis, we want to kind of look into where these issues resulted from in the first place. And what's important to know here is that the absence of green spaces not only increased our sedentary lifestyle, it also had a huge effect on mental health and stress-related illnesses, which increased in massive amounts, which we'll Shreya talk about a little later. Now, the main takeaway here is that by implementing more education and awareness, we can implement sustainable behavior within our societies and communities, overall leading to a happier but mainly healthier community. Shreya can take it over here.
Thank you, Micah. So there are a lot of different benefits that green spaces can have on a physical health, mental health, and community level. And before we get further, I just wanted to share some statistics really quickly. So 21% of individuals living in cities are more likely to develop an anxiety disorder, while 39% of these same people are 39% more likely to develop a mood disorder. So this is sort of why we hope that green spaces are able to mitigate some of these issues and help lower these rates. So to start us off, green spaces have been shown to really lower stress, and this happens because spending time in nature has been linked with lowering cortisol levels, which is a chemical involved within stress. And green spaces are also shown to boost moods and improve feelings of happiness and relaxation. And this is mainly because green spaces and just open spaces and being around trees all have a relaxing effect on the mind. And then thirdly, green spaces have been shown to really improve cognitive function, whether it be through improving focus, concentration, or just creativity. And this partially happens because being around green spaces really lets the mind recharge. So now, going on to some of the community aspects, we as people, as cities, as states, all have this ethical responsibility to take care of one another. And this all goes into community. So parks are a great way for community engagement to happen. And this is because people are able to see each other in passing, or they can plan events. And social interaction is so good for mental health because it provides people with a sense of belonging and community. However, going off of what Mike was speaking about earlier, there is a disparity in access to nature and its benefits because green spaces there's not an equal amount of green spaces among different communities. And so ensuring equitable distribution and accessibility of green spaces would promote social justice and lower economic and environmental inequalities. And then another community benefit is that green spaces really help within children's development, and this is because of some of the mental health benefits that we were speaking about earlier, such as the improved cognitive function and social interaction, which is so good for children, especially if they're able to spend time with other children in the parks. But it's also just a nice way for them to be outside and spend time and connect with nature. There are also a bunch of different benefits in terms of physical health for people. So green spaces, they really encourage activities such as cycling, walking, and jogging. But generally, cities tend to not have a high rate of physical activity because, for one, a lot of cities are not walkable, and also many cities just don't have these green spaces which act as a method for people to really engage in these activities. So as a result, cities tend to have lower rates of physical activity and higher rates of obesity and related health problems. In addition, cities have a lot of carbon emissions and air pollution, which lowers the air quality. And this poor air quality in combination with less physical activity makes the overall increased risk for communicable diseases much higher. And while this is really detrimental and bad for everyone, this especially affects people who are already immunocompromised or have pre-existing health conditions. And now I'll be passing it back to Micah, our ethical advisor.
Thank you so much, Shreya. So when taking all these issues and related benefits into account, we can see that it's mandatory to take action now. And this is where you, ISOCARP, comes into play. As your mission statement mentions, you guys strive to bridge the gap between planning theory and practice, but while also contributing to knowledge or generation and foster sustainability. You want to take action just like we do. And our goals together perfectly align with the UN goals we chose for today as well. When looking at SDG 13, which puts a big emphasis on taking urgent actions to save our climate right now, we can, in relation to that, tie that back to SDG 11, which mentions that cities and human settlements need to be more resilient, safe, and foster more sustainability. Now I'll hand it over to Owen again to talk about the legal perspectives.
Thank you. Last year, at the United States Conference of Mayors, a survey was produced in which 97% of mayors from across the United States reported that their city has seen an uptick in requests for mental health services. In addition to that, 88% of those same mayors surveyed said that their city is not adequately prepared to handle or to address these mental health requests. This relates a lot to what Micah and Shreya were just talking about, and the hypothesis that's been defined is the biophila hypothesis, the idea that humans are genetically predisposed to be attracted to nature. Artists know this concept well. When an artist is making something, they know that geometric shapes are more taxing on the human mind to look at and to process, and that's why organic shapes are often the concept of art. In this, we know that low-income areas, which often see the majority of, or the lack of green spaces in the majority of cases, often also have the highest mental health impacts. That is because much of their buildings in the artificial world that they have been implemented in is extremely geometric. And we know that by introducing green spaces into low-income areas and cities as a whole, there will be a mental health impact in a positive manner moving forward. Johnny?
Ultimately, mental and physical health have certainly had their costs as well. By 2030, it is estimated that the world will spend $7.1 trillion on mental health yearly. The urban impact on mental health is also profound, as the rate of mental health and mental illnesses doubles when you're in an urban environment. In terms of physical health as well, the U.S. spent $265 billion on this industry in 2020. But we had a 58% participation rate in these events, which means we're spending a lot on this industry, but are we really gaining what we need to out of it? Going along with that as well, chronic illnesses, obesity, and diseases have also grown at a trending rate right along with this fitness industry. Ultimately, the culmination of these events, the degradation of mental and physical health, the loss of our environment, has led to the urban exodus. People leaving these environments just due to their lack of desirability. As you can see, next slide. As you can see, in 2016, the net population growth began to decline for urban environments and ultimately dropped to the negatives in 2021 with the COVID-19 pandemic. This shows that the pandemic ultimately stimulated an already present trend of people leaving these urban environments. I'm going to hand it off to Shreya to talk a little bit more about this.
Thank you, Johnny. So one of the biggest problems that is caused by the urban exodus has to do with the ethical care for communities. So as we spoke about earlier, communities without green spaces experience unequal access to recreational and leisure opportunities, which overall just lowers their quality of life. And we have a couple solutions for this. So our first solution is to emphasize the importance of urban planning and policy in addressing the lack of green spaces within communities. So this can be done by advocating for the prioritization of this integration of green spaces in urban development plans, and this could look something like just relocating land. And secondly, this helps to enhance accessibility and encourages sustainable urban design practices. And we just hope that this solution will improve the quality of life for residents. And then our second solution has to do with focusing on community engagement as a key strategy in urban planning. So this emphasizes involving the local community to join in, especially in the decision-making process, because they know their specific and diverse needs. And this also will make sure that these residents are not only happy, but whenever they see these green spaces, they feel a sense of belonging and ownership because they helped cultivate this. Mm-hmm. And this encourages participation in conservation efforts, and this can go even further to just really accentuate community engagement through whether it be just events held on these green spaces or community gardens. And ultimately, this will all promote social interaction and community cohesion. And now I'll pass it along to Micah.
Thank you so much, Shreya. So I think these solutions are beautiful, but the good thing about this is that it also brings along a lot of ethical benefits. First of all, we want to talk about social inclusion. Green spaces are able to provide equitable and recreational opportunities for everyone, regardless of someone's socioeconomic background. Secondly, we want to put a big emphasis on cultural enrichment. Green spaces can serve as cultural hubs, but they're also a form of art expression, which is really important nowadays. And they also are open for community celebrations, which all brings us closer together while also focusing on nature. And then lastly, something we find really important is the fact that we also are talking about resilient communities. We see that communities living in green spaces are much better protected and resilient against the climate change impact, which we talked about earlier in this presentation. We can see that they have lower levels of air pollution, and they're also better protected against the reduced heat island. So by implementing all these solutions, we really, really hope that parks will now, instead of looking like this, will slowly start to look like this. Owen?
So, zoning laws are really hard to nail down on a national scale and especially an international scale, as they're extremely specific to municipalities and local areas. However, the United States Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, has a list of 86 different governments ranging from cities to counties to states, and that have put in place incentives or initiatives that aim to increase the amount of green initiatives that are taking place in cities. An example of this is in Washington, D.C. They're trying to incentivize green roofs with their stormwater retention credit program, in which a building owner would receive credit for the stormwater that does not run off into the city and is retained by their roof. This then could be used for tax purposes and or to pay the owner to help subsidize the cost of implementing the roof, as Johnny will discuss in a moment. In addition, we also have the New York Urban Forestry Grants, which have funded many trees being planted in cities across New York. Now, we also have a car-centric focus, and street trees make walking and being out and about in a city more pleasant. That is hard and works to combat a focus on cars and mobility within cities. Currently, developers have minimum parking requirements, which require them to develop so many parking spaces for every residential unit they build. And this burdens cities. In Los Angeles County alone has ended up with the development of more than 200 square miles of blacktop for parking purposes. In addition, we also have jaywalking laws that we know affect those who don't have access to private transportation unreasonably. An example of this is a mother and son in Atlanta, Georgia were walking across the street when the son was struck and hit by a drunk driver. Now, as mothers, parents, cousins, siblings. We are all aware that it's likely the drunk driver who's at fault here. However, in this case, the mother was prosecuted for vehicular homicide because of her son's death. We know that this does not make sense. It should not be the burden placed on the individuals within those cities. Street trees do not necessarily fix this problem, but it does represent a culture shift in which we will begin to focus on the individuals who live within a city and not just those who can afford private transportation. In addition to this, in 2015, a young group of Americans who were all under the age of 21 filed suit against the United States of America because they had filed suit against the United States of America because they were not protecting the population from the effects of climate change. Although Juliana versus the United States was ultimately unsuccessful, it again represents a culture shift in which the generations that are coming into power and will be inheriting these cities will soon care more about the way that the city has been built. In Isocarp, it makes sense that you build cities for this next generation. Johnny, what do the numbers say?
Obviously, breaking it down, green spaces are going to cost more than the gray alternative just simply because this is a living, breathing organism that you have to maintain. Trees can have a yearly cost of over $5 to maintain. Green roofs and rain gardens can cost a few dollars per square foot to maintain yearly, meaning that if you own a green roof on an average building, you could be looking at $15,000 to $20,000 yearly just in maintaining the green roof. Mm-hmm. Installation costs are also pretty severe. Green roofs can be very specific based on what type of roof you have, the type of green roof you're looking for, and the accessibility of your roof. So it can range from $15 to $30 per square feet just to install these as well. But ultimately, people are overlooking the financial benefits that green spaces provide. On a large scale, they provide large benefits and value to residential areas. Looking at a large scale, Central Park in Manhattan has provided a over $1 billion impact in revenue in New York City just because of its presence and its ability to increase residential value. The same thing has happened in San Francisco. San Francisco parks have a $150 yearly impact on residential house values in the city. Yard and street trees can also do the same thing, providing a 2 to 15% increase in residential value. On a larger scale with these trees, the city of Portland, Oregon has a $1.35 billion impact just due to the street trees increasing the residential value in the city. Energy savings is also something that we have to look at. As we've said, green infrastructure can cool temperatures in the cities. Cooling savings can be attributed $21 per tree in air conditioning savings. And as I said before, when a city green infrastructure can cool the city by up to 5 degrees. And when the average city has 100,000 people in it, and a study in Minnesota said that the average cost for a degree of air conditioning is around $2.85. You're looking at $1.5 million yearly in air conditioning savings in a city like that. Green roofs also have a similar effect, cooling the building that they sit atop. And another thing we have to look at as well is the stormwater and pollution savings as well. San Francisco especially is really big with this. They've had a $3 million annual savings for air pollution and a $2 million savings for stormwater retention in the last few years. In conclusion, urban areas have been under rough times. There has been a degradation of physical and mental health, there has been a loss of biodiversity, and it's ultimately causing people to leave these environments. And that's why we recommend that green spaces be reinvigorated into these environments, as it provides a multitude of benefits for the environment and the residents of the cities. Isocarp, thank you so much for listening, and we hope that you initiate these green initiatives into your missions in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Who on the judging panel would like to kick us off with a question about ethics?
I guess I can. Yeah. So I really appreciated the presentation in general. I think this is an amazing solution for cities, and the team was so adept at understanding the way that this changes things and how cities would benefit from this. And I think we've all experienced that sort of heat island effect when you go to a downtown area, especially here in Los Angeles. You're just like, how it's warmer in general inland, but it feels substantially warmer, and of course it has to do with the concrete. So I'll start with an ethics question, and it's really just asking, someone to elaborate a bit more on how specifically these green spaces are going to increase biodiversity, because I'm wondering like what needs to go into it. Having something on a roof, how is that actually enhancing the like greater ecosystem within the city itself? And then I want to know a little bit more, because you mentioned justice and equity, how, just thinking through how sort of like the socioeconomic distribution of people within cities. I have in mind Boston as one example where they sort of like greened the space, but it was in an especially expensive, ritzy part of town. And of course, people who have top paying finance jobs were able to access that space. But I'm just wondering how exactly the sort of like equity part will work for this solution. And I guess to tack onto that, how people will be incentivized to use the space in the ways that you recommend. Because I think you did a great job showing how this provides mental health benefits, but it doesn't it's not totally clear to me how people will be pushed to use it in those ways. Sorry, that's a lot of questions. But.
Absolutely. Okay, I'll start off with the biodiversity thing. I think when we're talking about biodiversity, we're mainly talking about larger scale projects. As I mentioned, the whole loss of biodiversity problem existed because we're destroying our natural areas, such as like forests or oceans in this case as well. So for that part, I'm trying to remember exactly what your question was.
Just how it's actually going to increase biodiversity in places that have lost it.
Yeah. So how it's going to actually improve is that here when we're talking about biodiversity, we're mainly talking about plants and animals, which are keeping us alive on the daily, but we're not so talking about like communities yet. But by simply providing them more places, we see it in many different countries too, especially in Europe. They just have huge like forests or even places for animals especially to live, which will also bring more animals to those places. It's kind of like, how do I explain this? Almost like an opportunity for more animals and plants to grow within our world together with like our communities, if that kind of ties into what you're asking.
Yeah.
And then I really wanted to catch up on the community aspect, I think, as well, about the socioeconomic status. I kind of wanted to relate it to an example of a city that we research, is in San Francisco, California. Yeah. So we see that we kind of have two big nature parks here. So we talked about Salesforce Park, which in my opinion really relates to the question you're asking, because we know that in San Francisco, their downtown area is also one of the more lower socioeconomic status areas, not the financial district, but right around that. We see a lot of homelessness and a lot of mental health related issues as well. And we see that by implementing this park in such an area, they're also more stimulated to make use of those parks, and it's also a place for them. They even talked about shelters and like offering green spaces as like a safer space for them to even survive if in the case one is homeless. And then I also want to tie back into the other nature space they have, which is Golden Gate Park, which is a huge park. It's even bigger than Central Park in New York City. And we really see, and from our research saw, that there are so many like diverse and different people within the park because it's so big and because there are so many like opportunities. You obviously have tourists who want to see the park, and like the rich financial people who want to do something there, spend their time. But we do see that there is a lot of opportunities for like lower income families, or even just like, again, the homeless people to be there, because it is open for everyone and very accepted. That's also why we like green spaces as to implement in cities in general, because it's free access to everyone. These parks I just mentioned don't need any tickets or any like form of like registration for it. We see it in the same way in Central Park. So I hope that kind of ties into your question. I just wanted to explain it with an example. Yeah.
If I could add as well, the addition of street trees and making access from the individual's home or residency to these parks will then further the ability and the access to get into them, as well as the stimulation that Micah mentioned. Once they're there, you have more of an ability and more of a desire to actually go and access them.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
More questions
still
from the
thinking.
panel?
It's a lot to absorb.
I have a couple. So are these parks going to be city owned and managed parks?
That would be the idea for now, with the exception of developers as they're building. So we had mentioned the idea of green facades or green roofs. Some of these, we keep mentioning Salesforce Park in San Francisco. It was built above the San Francisco Transit Hub. and their Salesforce obviously is the lead sponsor, but it is maintained by the city currently. However, as developers go, and hopefully this becomes a more common practice through your initiatives as ISOCARP developing these cities, it could become a new place for building residents to access, or people who work within the buildings, and even just a public space that they can be accessed via the company's dime, whoever owns it. But that, a combination of actual parks that have been set aside versus these ones that are on top of private buildings or on the side of private buildings.
So in terms of funding to create and maintain these areas, that would be.
So that goes back to the incentives that have already started to be being developed, such as the one we mentioned with Washington D.C. There's a bunch throughout California, as well as many of the northeastern states, Massachusetts, you mentioned, in Boston. Those exist, but it is on the developers moving forward.
I have a question about, once you've built these parks, it's obviously to maintain them, it's pretty resource intensive in terms of water. So you have a lot of water that goes into sprinklers. You have a lot of sometimes gas that goes into powering lawnmowers and leaf blowers and all of that. So how does that factor into your recommendations in terms of the sustainability benefits of the park?
Ultimately, that's definitely something that we considered. As I said, it does definitely cost more to maintain the green spaces just because of the maintenance costs and stuff like that. But I think just because of the benefits that they provide as well, I think that's what we're trying to incentivize people to take advantage of.
In addition to that, there is the opportunity to begin implementing native species. So grasses are not native. The majority of grasses are not native to North America as a whole. And therefore, if you start taking native plants, it might not seem as appealing as a golf course lawn, as you might think of it, but it still has the same effect. And it can really introduce, again, and re-illuminate that biodiversity throughout these parks.
That's my question. So I was worried about water, particularly being in an arid area. So I'm thinking, drought tolerant.
Yeah.
But I think if you're using a drought tolerant plant, doesn't that mean there's less evaporation, so it's not going to mitigate the heat? I mean, I don't know, I'm asking. Have you thought about that?
So a lot of the urban heat island effect, and yes, that's true, but a lot of it is the actual materials that hold the heat. So a block of concrete, a rock, basically, it can absorb and hold heat, whereas any plant's going to reflect it, and it's not going to hold it as necessary.
Even a cactus.
Even a cactus.
That doesn't need a whole lot of water.
It will reflect energy, and it will not absorb it as a rock would or blacktop would.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because there's been times where we have water shortages, in, at least in LA. So when you said fountain, it's are the fountains going to be recyclable water or? Okay.
I'd say I think it would depend on the city planners and I guess also depend on the city that it's in because if it's in a city where they get regular rainfall, it's easier to just relocate water that comes from to the sewers and to the not sewers necessarily but through the pipes and re-put that within the fountains. But within a fountain, even in a city that's drier, a lot of the times in fountains they're able to recycle the water, so it's the water goes in and it goes out and it gets reused. So yes, that one-time water would be necessary, but the hope is that it just keeps recycling back and forth. It goes up and then it goes back down, and it's that same water cycling over and over again.
Thank you.
So there's a concept of gray water. Gray water is in a home from the kitchen sink. Unfortunately, zoning has kind of disallowed it forever. Is there any way to incorporate that thought into your presentation?
Absolutely. That comes back to the city planning and the city initiatives that we really need to start having these conversations with city officials. So permitting will allow that, and permitting changes, which ISOCARP should be at the forefront of.
In terms of, the core of what might be the ethical dilemma here is there's limited money in any city, and you have to choose where to direct those funds, and certainly massive benefits that you've demonstrated. Is there any maybe examples or any can you think of from other city programs, like does that money come out of a different bucket? Is it kind of moving money out of one bucket to put it into the landscaping bucket, and which bucket is it moving out? Because for there to be a dilemma, you're you're having to choose between something, and I don't know what I'm choosing to move money away from and into.
I think that's certainly a really great question. One thing I would add, just in terms of the ethical dilemma, I think when investing in like a park in terms of something else, I think you think about what traffic you might be bringing to the city in general. I feel like San Francisco, especially just because of its abundance of parks, has a large tourism impact. I feel like a lot of people come to visit the city due to the parks, and I think there's also just people wanting to live around these green areas as well. I'm not so sure about where the money might be coming from, but I think just from the ethical dilemma standpoint, I think that's something to think about.
And just a quick add, I think for the choice that you mentioned, I think in our eyes too, it's almost a choice that's gonna have to be made anyway. It's either now or later, because we mentioned that by implementing these solutions and benefits now, they're gonna have we are in a climate crisis. They're gonna have to happen. Solutions are gonna have to come sooner or later anyway. And I think we really stand for implementing them now, because at the end of the day, you'll probably be saving your costs, especially if we're looking at increased inflation, especially in the United States as well. But regardless of that, it's almost like a choice that's gonna have to be made anyway. And then just tying back to what Johnny said about it, I think it's just averaging out the costs with the benefits over the implemented costs in the beginning.
So go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think IBESCC could also work with certain cities, because cities have money that they have set aside for projects, and I feel as if obviously cities do have a limited amount of money, but I think cities are getting to the point as years get by of like Micah was saying, realizing that these changes need to happen. So I think funding could come from there, and there are also probably I don't know too much in detail about this, but more private funds involving environmental agencies, because there are a lot of environmental groups that are really trying to make this happen. So I think IBESCC could probably pair up with such organizations to see if there's more opportunities for funding.
So a similar question, not about funding, but about community engagement. I like the idea that you guys presented to have community engagement at the forefront in the planning portion of it, but it's also like herding cats, right? So we're going to have a lot of people in there that are going to want the garden or the green space, and there's certain people that will not want it in their backyard or not in their neighborhoods and whatnot, because they're giving up something else in their neighborhood. So I guess, how do you navigate the ethical aspect of that? I mean, because you're going to have a difference of opinions from a lot of different people, and I think it's great to have that in there. But if you could offer any thoughts about how to navigate the ethical concerns about that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good concern that we definitely talked about before too. I really therefore like the idea of engaging communities and people within cities, residents, within the planning, but of course it doesn't always go your way. You can't always get everything you want. I think for us it's mainly recognizing we need to have a change, so it's almost not I don't want a park, I want a city. That's obviously not how it works. As an ethical standpoint, I think we just really need to emphasize on the opportunities that come from these green spaces, which will probably motivate people to be a bigger fan of these green spaces too. I think what we mentioned before, I really like the art expressions and the community celebrations. It's a very much working together project in my eyes as well from an ethical standpoint. So I hope that answers your question a little bit. I don't know if anyone wants to add.
Yeah.
When it comes back to that opportunity cost of whether or not the not in my backyard or this for that, I think it comes back to, as Micah just alluded to, the marketing of it.
Yeah.
What is the actual benefit that you're coming towards how does the community benefit from this? And if you are giving up, especially in low-income areas, that one grocery store, we know food deserts exist. If that's the cost, then is it worth it for this city? Should we move it? And then are you removing low-income housing? These are really difficult conversations and questions to be asking. And that is something we will certainly get back to you on with more information moving forward.
And going also more into what you were saying about how people obviously no one's sorry, let me start over. Not everyone is going to be happy with the decision, but I think it's sort of similar to how a lot of the times a building will be created near where people live and people are unhappy, but ultimately there's not as much they can do about it. But like Micah was saying, people in this case have an opportunity to chip in and be involved within the process. But also, as Johnny was talking about earlier, people value homes near parks, and if let's say a bigger scale project such as a park is going to be in this neighborhood, for instance, it likely will increase the value of people's homes, which is an incentive financially for people.
And I quickly just want to add to the concept that Owen was talking about earlier, that as humans and communities, we're naturally drawn to green spaces, like you said.
Biophilia.
Which will hopefully make the process a little easier.
Well, thank you so
Can
much.
I-
I'm sorry.
I was just going to say that. Can I ask one more question? Thank you so much for all these answers. I have a question that I wonder if you've worked through, and this also builds off of the question of sort of where the money's coming from. There were helpful numbers, but how much green space is required to actually offset heat within a heat island? How many projects and what scale of projects? Because I could see a park being thrown in downtown LA, and I think everyone would know that's not going to offset whatever the problem is. So what is actually required within the city, and what scale investment is required for it to really make that kind of change and to promote sort of the ethical motivation behind?
Yeah.
That's a really good question. I think it ultimately definitely depends on the city and what the city offers, I would say, because I feel cities definitely vary in terms of temperature, landscape, etc. So I think it comes down to a case basis, I would say.
Okay.
It's also not a one fixed solution by any means, but we spoke about green roofs earlier, and part of what makes the urban landscapes absorb heat so much is oftentimes these metal roofs of these buildings, or not necessarily metal, whatever material they are, but they specifically tend to be 30 degrees hotter than the environment, which is a very large number, and that 30% ends up being just a 1 to 7 degree difference in temperature. But hopefully adding some greenery to those roofs will make a huge difference.
And I also think with that, small steps lead to bigger jumps. I feel we sometimes underestimate how much the little things can do, and a lot of that also has to do with our attitude towards these plans, such as if we think a park isn't gonna fix the problem immediately, we could just not do it. But that's not, I think, the attitude we need to have to solve these problems, especially from an ethical standpoint. So I think it's very important that we implement small changes wherever we can to overall have bigger changes within cities.
And like Owen was saying, how street trees represent this shift in culture, we also hope that with all these changes in these initiatives, and with IBESCC being one of the first among the city planning industry to take these changes, that others will follow suit, and also just that it'll lead to more legislative and financial benefits being added, because it's a lot of different steps that need to happen for all of these problems to be solved. But this is a very great start, and that's why we want IBESCC to be a part of this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Should we take our ISOCARP hats off and provide some constructive feedback on your presentation?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Overall, you know the subject matter very, very well. My favorite part of these presentations are the question and answer part, because it's a little less formal, and you can really tell that you know the material really well, and all four of you evenly. So that was really strong, I thought. And I love the visual of the two rooftops. That one was my favorite. This one. That one really gave me a really good visual, because you've been researching this for months, I'm sure, but I'm just seeing this for the first time, and that really gave me a good idea. Oh, I get it, I would have liked to have heard a little bit more, and I probably was going to ask a question about it, but I think maybe in the feedback section might be better. I think that the other benefit that you might consider talking about is the economic impact of people leaving. Because you talk about people leaving, but I didn't quite hear why that's a bad thing. And I think if people leave, then there's an economic impact to that, and people leaving mean that certain businesses may not be sustainable if there's not enough people in that particular area. So then businesses might close. So you want to keep people there so that to support particularly small businesses. And the green space can help do that because people will stay and they'll work in the area and they'll be active consumers in those communities. So I see that as an economic benefit, that when trying to convince anyone, the city or anyone, particularly the private or the public-private partnerships, that happens all the time, and that's really important to push and talk about. Because because the city can only do so much. My husband works for the city, and I used to work for the city of LA, too. And they can provide, like with the homelessness, they can provide social services. They can provide sometimes land, city-owned land. But there's certain things that the bureaucratic process is so slow and so tedious that they're not good at solving the whole problem. But the public and private partnership together is really an ideal solution, because some things the private sector can do that the cities can't, and some things cities can do well that the private sector can't. So the public-private partnerships, I think, is really important to push as well into making this a reality and successful.
Yeah, I would also echo that. It was a great presentation. My biggest concern, like hearing it though, is taxes. Like it's going to hit taxes. And so I think like having the developers like in partnerships with city and stuff like that. We've seen projects around here even where we've had a lot of successes where they've worked with private and public sectors and really were able to protect the spaces that we needed to, biono wetlands I'm thinking about right here, as well as like urban development with still having green space and stuff like that in there. And then the residents are actually paying for that maintenance and that ongoing stuff for that. So because if we come to the city side of it, I think that's where we hit the roadblock, is how do we how do we support that?
I think you've also got a lot of companies right now who are touting their commitment to sustainability. So it's kind of like ask the companies to put their money where their mouth is and say, look, if you're going to tout your commitment to sustainability and biodiversity, why don't you sponsor, this park, and we'll let you have a billboard there, or something to give you some credit, to give you some marketing and visibility, and that way you can kind of generate funds. Kind of like, I think you said it was the Salesforce Park. So that idea that has a name associated with it. So now people are going to associate Salesforce with a company that cares about the environment.
Absolutely.
So I think there's opportunities, because I do think companies have money that they want to spend on making themselves more green.
So, great presentation. I love the way you handed off and received to each other. It was just great. Of course, it's a good thing to do. And I think in planning new cities, it's going to be required, there's new issue. Would like to see more on the inner city, because it's not like no one's going to want this in my area. Everybody wants this, and if it's there, they'll use it. But it's all space and density, and also inner cities. If we're talking about low income, that's where you can't afford to add more expense. So it's a real tough thing, and I'd like to see it. As a developer, and what you suggested, I've had deals where right now I have 240 acres. And I'm allowed very little density. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give away 80% of it for parkland, and then I'll get all of that density in what's left. So that's how it works. But in existing cities, I don't know what you do. So I think I'm gonna recommission you to go find that out.
I kind of, where at least in my experience in LA with homelessness, when you have parks that are easily accessible to everyone, which is fantastic in terms of equity, but that tends to be where the homeless tend to go. And so they're gonna come. So you're gonna create this green space that's very accessible, which is fantastic, and different people from different socioeconomic backgrounds can use it, but you're gonna get homeless people there, and so that's gonna come up, and so I think that should be addressed before it happens. And it's not an easy one. It's not an easy one. So that's something to think about. And I was going to also mention like an example of a public-private partnership that worked really well in the city of LA addressing homelessness. This particular, the private company took old shipping containers and created small homes for homeless. They were literally just the shipping containers that were no longer being used, and they were donated to this project, or they paid very little for the shipping containers. So they're basically reusing. So there's a nice repurposing, recycling element to this story, and then because that's the part that the city gets really caught up in their bureaucracy, because they have to, they have to do all this. Offer opportunities for different kinds of companies and they have to go through this vetting process that just takes years, and it just takes too long. So the private company is better at that part, and then the city part was the social services, job training, child care for the homeless, and that part, that's what they're better at. So the two of them together, and it ended up being very cost effective, and it ended up happening pretty quickly as in like within a year or two. So that's just an example, and that you wouldn't necessarily do that for these parks, but I just wanted to share an example of how a public-private partnership could work.
Yeah, this is the sort of the question that I asked you as part of this, because the homelessness and the association with parks is kind of like the elephant in the room in a lot of these conversations. San Francisco is a very unique case because I think there's a hospitality there that is not always the case everywhere. And there's a lot of contention just like on that sort of environment. So I had sort of the same thing to say. I wanted to just add one thing, because I completely agree that the slide with the image of the Salesforce Park and the other park was so good. And there was a couple where there was images you kind of like rushed through to the next thing, and I was like, wait, I want to know what it's like inside the park, because the one I brought up in Boston, the Greenway there, they turned what was former highway space into a green belt, which has like done so much good for the city. And I think one of the allures of it, which you answered really well, saying marketing would do this, we'd show the reasons why this is something you want. It kind of like increases quality of life. But I think the visuals, because I loved your slides, but I do think even more visuals on like bringing the audience into what it looks like and what it would be like there. Mm-hmm. That's sort of like my tiny thing that I would add, because I thought it was really polished presentation. I loved that everyone worked together, especially in the Q&A. That's when you can tell that everyone kind of like knows a bit of each other's parts in addition to having their own part. So I appreciate it. It was a very interesting presentation too.
Fantastic.
Yeah, thank you.
You really did a lot of hard work.
Yeah.
So yay.
I really appreciate all your feedback and insight, and I think I can speak for all of us when we're all really excited to like research and look more into everything all of you shared.
Cool.
So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And we know 25 minutes is a long time, so you guys did a really good job with that too. Thank you.
Thank you.